this is a great occasion to have Christopher Merrill with us today, the editors of your book, me, Sukrita Paul Kumar, and Vinita Agrawal. It is such a pleasure for us, the editors, to be talking about the yearbook with Christopher Merrill. So thank you, Christopher, for making it for this recording with us. We'll have a little conversation for about half an hour to 40 minutes on the yearbook and poetry in general as well that is happening in India. So Vinita Agrawal, we would have you here also to be introduced, and I am Sukrita Paul Kumar, both of us being the editors. So
hello, Christopher, and thank you very much for agreeing to talk to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And Christopher Merrill, as he mentioned, or maybe didn't mention just yet, but it's so much there, I mean, the whole world knows, he's the director of a very, very important program, the International Writing Program at Iowa, which also means that he has, for the last, I would say about 15 years, is that right, Christopher?
Actually, I'm in my 21st year.
Good Lord.
I'm getting a little old in the tooth.
Wow, wow. But poetry and literature is making you look younger. So lovely, with all the energy, creative energy around. And I think we could just start right away by focusing on you, Christopher, and your long tenure as the director of this wonderful program, which also has meant that you have had ample opportunity to meet and read poets from all over the world, different kinds of poetry. So it would be very pertinent for us, Vinita and I, to want to know from you as to how do you see Indian writing in English, and how do you see any distinctive features of Indianness in Indian poetry? How would you like to talk about it, particularly after you're having seen the yearbook, which unfortunately you haven't got a hard copy yet, but surely a soft copy of the book. And we would like your initial comments on that. I mean, particularly the specificity of Indianness.
Well, I think that I will begin by noting that my closest friend for nearly 20 years was the Kashmiri poet Agha Shahid Ali, who from the early 1980s was schooling me in the intricacies of writing poetry in English from someone for whom English was not actually his mother tongue. Urdu was, and he also spoke Kashmiri. So much of my thinking about Indian poetry is through the lens, if you will, of Shahid's own wonderful work. And I know there's a first biography of his about him has just been published in India. And when I took this job at the University of Iowa in 2000, the first writer I brought in to give a public reading was Shahid, who was here. And I have the date very firmly in my mind because he was my daughter's godfather, and it was her 5th birthday. It was also the day, very early that morning, that my daughter's grandfather, my father-in-law, passed away from the same kind of brain cancer that would take Shahid about a year later. By that point, he had already lost his vision from the brain cancer, so he had all of his poems memorized, and that was, he gave really quite an amazing reading there. But one of the things I was thinking as I was reading this yearbook was how much of my own thinking about poetry in general has been shaped by Shahid. And I was thinking particularly of a poem that he wrote, I see Chile in my rear view mirror. And in that poem, he rhymed blue tar, that would be on a road, with Utah. And that
Oh.
only rhymed because of his accent, Utah and Bluta. And in the book, there is a poem that quotes Shahid, in the yearbook, that quotes
Yes.
Shahid, "Mad heart, be brave."
Yes.
It seemed to me that what Shahid was always counseling both himself and his readers, and particularly me as his close friend for all those years, was for us to recognize we all have a mad heart and we must be brave in it. And so the first thing I would say is that I want to applaud you for putting together this yearbook in the midst of the pandemic. It seems to me to be a quintessential kind of Shahid move, completely counterintuitive, but to try to celebrate all the ways in which poetry has been written in English in India over the last year, a time that has been for all of us a tragedy, something that has revealed shortcomings in our own respective societies, that has made us despair of public health policies around the world, and the kind of thing that poets pay attention to and try to do what they do best, which is to sing something from their mad hearts about the times in which we live. So I was particularly taken with that.
So appropriate.
Yeah, it's very heartening to know that you've read the poems in the yearbook, because yes, there is that poem about mad heart, be brave. I think it's Satyajit Sarna's poem, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, I think so.
I'm trying to say where I have some notes here, and my handwriting is so atrocious that it's kind of amazing that look at that. Yeah. So maybe some other general sort of thoughts I had about this. I don't want to speak too generally about Indian poetry in English, because it seems to me that poetry depends upon particularity at every moment. The more particular we are in what we try to write about, the better chance we have of speaking heart to heart across the generations and the miles and the oceans. But in a sort of general way, I thought, well, I'm reading a lot of poems in a kind of free verse. There were some exceptions to that, some prose poems, a high bun. But I thought to myself, except for the locale, a lot of these poems had a certain kind of familiarity to me, in that they are similar to poems written daily in my country. And so that was something that struck me. And that's why in some cases there were some prose poems. I want to see if I can see which ones I'm looking at here. Let's see. There's a found poem from A Sport and a Pastime by the late American novelist James Salter, which I thought, now there's an inventive use of the language. One of the things I thought about that is that we've had in American poetry over the last 10, 15 years, a whole slew of found poems, balanced also by poems that are called erasures, poems where you might take some kind of an otherwise ordinary text and use whiteout to see what other kinds of language, what other kinds of poetic meaning might be teased out. And that's just seemed to me to be a piece of language that I found quite interesting. If we want to flip to, there's a poem by Aswin Vijayan on page 47, a woolly mammoth on the shore. One of the things that struck me about this poem is that it's a kind of hybrid, mixing verse and a little section of prose poetry. in a way, a sort of inverted high bun, if you will. We had a high bun a little bit earlier in the book. And I'm always attracted to those kinds of moves where people try to do something that isn't necessarily done all that often. So to create a found poem out of a sport and a pastime or to use something from to be mixing genres is quite attractive to me.
Aswin's poem is also a kind of a shape poem, if you notice. It's kind of shaped like a woolly mammoth.
Yeah, there were some concrete poems, and you know, in English that goes back to those wonderful poems of George Herbert in the 17th century. But and from time to time reappear, particularly in a kind of comic fashion with the poems that Apollinaire wrote in the early part of the last century. I was also thinking, because Shahid and I both shared a friendship with the late American poet Mark Strand, and there's a poem by another late American poet named Al Poulin, who he just took lines that Mark had uttered in different interviews over the years, and he strung them together, and it begins. The poem is called Mark Strand, a found poem, and it begins with, "I have a feeling I am a metaphor for my own being," which is such a pretentious line, you know, but it's the kind of thing that he would say. And then it ended with a line that goes, if I were in the movies, I'd be a winner. And Mark Strand, he was almost a dead ringer for Clint Eastwood. He was a very handsome man, and that's again one of those ways in which poetry can reveal something about our time that is unusual.
So I think one of the things that's been happening, particularly in India, and I think a lot of places all over the world, is that because of the way English it does prevail everywhere. So there are variations, of course, but the point is that what is beautiful is that in India in particular, because across time and across place, across countries, there have been influences that have been coming through into English, through English, to the poets who are mostly brought up in English language, through English language education, right? So there is a receptivity of influences of a certain kind. And my problem always, and I'm sure Vinita would agree with me, is the anxiety of influence, as Harold Bloom might put it. So sometimes the influence takes over, and where are you then in the poem, right? So that anxiety is always there. But I believe that we have now come of age, and this is a whole lot of poetry that is happening in English language from all over the country. One of the questions that comes to my mind, and particularly for you to think about perhaps and comment, particularly as an outsider to it in a way, though you're quite an insider the way I imagine you by now, insider to many, many countries, right? But how do you still, I would emphasize on that. Do you see that there is any grounding of the Indian poet, or rooting is the word. Is there any rooting that you see, something that has, particularly through the yearbook, does it come out? How is this Indianness, the rootedness in India projected?
Well, I think I'll try to answer that in a more musical fashion, if you will. When Shahid came under the spell of the absolute brilliant formalist, my namesake James Merrill, and began to try to write formal poems in English. And of course, Shahid always wrote only in English.
Yes.
The thing that was interesting to me was his first move was to write in syllabics, because he couldn't really hear English stresses. And I always understood that to be a function of growing up in Urdu, in Kashmiri, and then English being the more of the language of school, right? So, and he and I would have conversations where I say, well, no, isn't it funny, Shahid? You've got all these 10-syllable lines. The first four are perfectly regular iambic pentameter lines, and then these next three are just completely all over the place. And it was because he could count the syllables, but he couldn't necessarily hear the stresses. And for a while, I was kind of cranky about that. And because English is my first language, so I would hear the stresses. But over time, I began to see that what he was contributing to American English poetry was a different way to hear the very language. And so when I think about Indian poetry in English, I'm thinking that I think are there 17 official languages in India and countless
24,
dialects? 24. So every poet who chooses to write in English also has in his or her auditory imagination at least one, and generally two or three other languages rattling around in there, and that's going to shape their use of English in ways that for an outsider from a distance might think, wow, why are they doing that? That's kind of a funny sound.
Yeah.
But poets depend on those funny sounds, right? Just go back to rhyming Utah and Bluta. It was hysterically funny what Shahid did.
Yeah.
But I think that's part of what can come through in the wit of everybody engaging in this language. And it's much more complicated in my view than to simply say, as was fashionable 20, 30 years ago, the empire writes back, right? Speaking about whether it was what poets on the subcontinent were doing to English, or what poets in Francophone, writers in the Francophone countries were doing to French. What they were doing is expanding our sense of what might be possible. We hosted in my program some years ago a fantastic German novelist named Sasha Stanisic. And he was born and raised in Bosnia-Herzegovina. He left at the age, I think, of maybe 12 or 13 for Germany during the war. And so he came of age as a writer in German. And his first novel, How the Soldier Repaired the Gramophone, was a bestseller in lots of different countries, lots of languages. And I remember talking to a German writer. I said, so, what does Sasha's German sound like to a native German speaker? And this writer said that she envied Sasha for his freedom in Germany, because he came to the language from Bosnian, and so that left him free to do things in the language that somebody raised in it as their mother tongue would never feel that kind of freedom. And I think since poetry is, as Octavio Paz would say, the freest expression of the human spirit, that takes place on the linguistic level, and it is a function of all the different sounds that are rattling around in our imagination. So when I'm reading the yearbook and I'm seeing poems that have lots of Hindi words, I'm just thinking of the poem called Gutan Suffocation by K. Srilata. And it seemed to me, and I noticed that the next poem by the same poet had to do with George Floyd, a poem about not being able to breathe. Now, everybody knows about the George Floyd story was a global kind of outpouring, but I found the more interesting poem for me was the Gutan Suffocation, because in a way, this poet was exploring something that was more local. It's the Hindi word, but it also struck for me where we could be talking about COVID and ventilators on the one hand, but we could also be talking about air pollution. We could be talking about the sorts of things that George Floyd underwent. I can't breathe is one of those lines that resonates across every culture these days. So there was a nice mingling of the two languages that gave me insight into a particular moment in history.
And interestingly, you know, they would, at one point of time, the linguists would say it is interference of the mother tongue. And it was, you know, because, it was, English was his master's voice, I would say, you know, the language of power. But now the same thing has been seen as a positive measure. You know, the mediation that happens between English and the other tongues that are operating in our minds. So Vinita, would you like to ask something?
Yes, just to take that the word Guten a little further, as you said, you know, it can be interpreted in many ways. It can also be interpreted from the gender perspective when women live in Wales and they feel suffocated by that. So that's a wonderful observation from you. So being the director of the Iowa International Writing Program, Chris, you've been exposed to a lot of poetry and poetry from all over the world. So would you say that, I mean, how can one sift poetry from non-poetry? What is that magic trick through which, you know, non-poetry can be sifted? And would you say that it's the media hype that kind of promotes one sort of poetry and that becomes a norm for the readers? Would you like to comment on that?
That's a marvelously complicated question to ask. and I'll try to I'll try to answer it in a couple of different ways.
Make it more complicated.
Because the first thing that comes to mind is I'll show it to you. It just arrived today. This is a posthumous volume of John Ashbery, and what it is 5 unfinished longer works that his assistant knew about. And I started reading it. It's just marvelous in the way so much of Ashbery is. But it made me think that when he wrote his poem, 3 poems, which consisted of 3 very long prose poems, one of the things he was wanting to do was to take the language of prose, even bureaucratese or all the different ways in which we use prose, and see if he couldn't find a poetic element to that. And so the question of sifting poetry from non-poetry, I think, is really the dream of every poem, to find the most, to do something with the most mundane bit of language that you can. The American poet W.S. Merwin once said that he often noticed how in reading Dante's Divine Comedy, some of the most moving lines were, in his view, the most pedestrian. And the reason why they were so moving was because he might use all sorts of rhetorical flourishes and images on the way to saying something in a very plain voice. And the juxtaposition of the highly rhetorical flourishes with the simple, plain spoken line created a kind of tension that was for him deeply pleasurable. And so I think that as a poet, we're always trying to sift from some kind of little bit of language, something that we can turn it into poetry. I'll give you an example of how this works in practice. As you may know, Shah had challenged American poets to write, as he said, real ghazals in English. And what part of the reason I think that he was so keen on doing that, and I never actually addressed it with him, but I thought about it in retrospect, was that when he translated Fez Ahmed Fez, he translated Fez's ghazals rather in a somewhat familiar free verse. And then, and I know this because I published that book of his, in a poetry series. Rebel Silhouette, beautiful book. But it was not long after I published that he and James Merrill were in this really quite active conversation about writing in a more formal way. And somewhere in there, he started thinking, I want to do, I'm going to challenge American poets to write real ghazals, not rip off the form in the way that they had done in the 60s and 70s. So one day I was house sitting in Hawaii for the poet W.S. Merwin, and Shah had called, and we referred to Merwin's place as the Promised Land because it was 18 acres of a botanical preserve of palms growing that were either extinct in the wild or on the edge of going extinct. And so we called this place the Promised Land. And Shah had called one day, and I went to make a cup of tea. I could tell we were going to have a long conversation. And Merwin, who was a devout Buddhist, there was no meat in the house. There was no sugar in the house. And so I said to Shahid, there's no sugar in the Promised Land. And, he had that kind of imagination. He'd say, that sounds like the opening line of a ghazal. Right?
Wow.
And so a lot of what went on in our conversations, and I think this is what poets are always doing, is, your ear is tuned to hear something a little bit off, right? There's no sugar in the Promised Land. I just said it to be funny. But in fact, let's play around with it. Swear by the olive in the God-kissed land. And that turned into his ghazal called Land. And I replied with my own ghazal for him.
Incredible.
So I think that's what our effort always is our ears are open for something that might happen on the corner.
Also, I think in the context of those who are, like listening or readers of poetry, right? They also need to have the same kind of attunement to that ear, I suppose, to be able to hear that. So I think in the context of this yearbook that we did, one of the objectives has been to try to, hear that what is poetry and bring it together and different kinds. I mean, there is no one single aesthetics to it. It isn't frozen in time or place. So I like to use that term, the dynamics of aesthetics of poetry, And I think our aim, one of the objectives was to basically, try to capture the aesthetics of that period, right? Even if it's over 1 year, and see the diversity of it in terms of both theme and the style. And we're just wondering, does the objective, sometimes we have the existential angst about it. Should we, how long can we do it? And is it worth it? Would you like to reassure us on that front? So, what are we trying to do? Is the objective achieved? We are feeling good about it as of now. So what are your comments on that? The objective.
Well, here's one thought I had about that was that I edited a poetry series for I think about 10 or 15 years at Peregrine Smith Books, and I would get literally hundreds of manuscripts to read time after time. And one of the things I noticed was that there would come a moment reading a manuscript where I realized nothing I had read had actually penetrated my ear because I had read so many poems that I wasn't able to hear it. And so I think that the task as an editor, which is similar to the task of the poet trying to sift from some kind of mundane language, the poetic, the editor's task is to widen their ears to hear things that might make you uncomfortable at first, that don't seem like poetry at all. I don't know if you've had this experience. I've had it many times where I'll start to read a poet and I can't stand what they're doing, and then three months later, I feel like, I've got to read that poet, and because when I couldn't hear it, it was because it was pointing to something that I maybe wasn't ready to hear yet, but that at a certain point would then come to feel central to what I needed to hear. So your task is going to be how to keep your ears wide and on the alert for things that are outside of what you tend to think of as what makes for a poem. I think in the questions you were sending me ahead of time, you talked about the best American poetry.
Yes,
and the thing I
about
like
to come
about
to
the best,
that.
what I like about the Best American Poetry series is that every year they invite someone else to edit it. It's David Lehman's series.
Yes.
But each year he invites somebody new in. There's another magazine called Agni, which does a similar thing, that they have they look for a different editor each time, just to keep things fresh, if you will, to bring a different perspective on it.
We tried to do something like, well, not exactly a guest editor, but what we did was we widened the arena by involving we call it a committee of reviewers, and we invited nearly 8 of them to help us in sifting. It was primarily for this reason, just in case we miss out on hearing the notes or whatever, then it's kind of spread out. Of course, it made our job very complicated, but that is what we tried to do. Yes.
So that's very sound advice. Yes, please continue.
I edited a book a few years ago with 2 dear friends called Flash Fiction International.
Yes.
And we realized by the end of it that we had probably read close to 10,000 stories, flash fiction, to publish a book of about 200 and some odd pages.
Yes.
And we had, so there were 3 editors, but we had a team of about 10 readers, and they would, they'd all score the stories. And then the 3 of us would get on the phone and we would argue like crazy, and we had so many battles over the phone and then in person. And that was where I think whatever success the book has, it was a function of those arguments, where one editor was hearing something the other 2 couldn't hear, and was fighting hard to keep that story in the conversation.
So that's very sound advice from you, Christopher. And I use the word sound with the intention of the pun on the word sound. And to not hold the mantle of editorship very tightly, and to hold it loosely and more inclusively. That's a very big takeaway from this conversation. And also to hear the backstories of Aga Shahid Ali, who's been one of my favorite poets, forever, and of many Indians and the world over. He's been very, very loved. He's a beloved poet, so to speak. So it's been very, very rewarding to hear these stories about him that you've shared, and no one could have done it for us, except you. Now we have Manan Kapoor's book, of course, regarding the biography of Aga Shahid Ali, but you've got these wonderful stories to share with us. So that's it's like a bonus to this conversation. But to conclude, and maybe, yes, Sukrita, please.
No, I was just thinking, talking about Aga Shahid Ali, because we used to have bus rides together. He was my colleague. And the reason I mentioned this is because, he used to be constantly singing. And that much for the musical ear, and he would do it unabashedly in a bus, public bus. And then I had the courage. I was also learning how to sing at that time, and we would sing together, and those were such precious moments, because all the sense of and I think classical music does that to you, particularly classical music, the kind of sounds and the rhythm and the cadence that a poem needs to have probably rests on music, sense of music.
As a matter of fact, I've heard Ranjit Hoskote talk about this extensively, how to bring the cadence of music into the lyrics of your poem, into the text of your poetry. So I think we've touched a few very, very important topics and issues in this conversation. But to conclude, perhaps, would you like to offer advice to us for the future volumes of the Yearbook of Poetry? As you already said, we might, give it to other editors in the years to come, so that that sound that's heard is more diverse. But apart from that, would you like to offer more advice?
Well, I hope, since you have put so much work into making this happen, that you will always retain a tight hold on how it goes, but that you would include the other voices just to challenge you going out.
Mhm.
And of course, you put this anthology together in the midst of a pandemic, which is the kind of thing that that mad heart be brave. That's where that comes from. Early on in the pandemic, Ram Devanini, who founded the wonderful journal Ratapalex, and Bob Holman got in touch with me and said, you know, all those years ago when Shahid was dying, we put together that a ghazal chain for Shahid that began with that couplet I gave you: there is no sugar in the promised land, swear by the olive in the God-kissed land. And more than 100 poets contributed to it. So they called me up and they said, we want to do something similar during this pandemic. And so, you know, what can we think of? And we started playing around with that idea, you know, poetry is like bread. That was what Neruda said. And so, because I'd started the ghazal for Shahid all those years ago, they asked me to start it this time. You know, if as Neruda said, if as Neruda wrote, poetry is like bread, then let it leaven this dark time and be my bread.
Beautiful, beautiful, lovely.
And then we sent it out around the world, and all kinds of people sent these wonderful ghazals. And they recorded it, and Ram took them and wove them into this pandemic ghazal. And it struck me, now that's the kind of thing that only poets can do. And you know, there's no money to be made in it. It's just the freest activity of the spirit. It makes life a little better, right?
You spend money, and you spend energy, and you spend time, and you know, and in fact, if you,
this bread feeds the spirit, Chris.
Yes,
exactly.
I was also, Vinita, thinking of how, you know, it's also beer to some, you know, it needs to be brewed, and, you know, and then you are high on it. You know,
that's a good one, Sukrita. That's a great one.
Just the right amount of lifting happens, you know. If you go too much out of, you know, you transcend too much, then where is the ground? So it has to be just that much.
Very well said. Well said.
I think as they say at the Mashara, va va, right?
Va va. Yes. Lovely. I think on that note, we could probably conclude. And Christopher, lovely to be having you with us. And I believe that there is lots more to also talk about, and we can probably carry this on at some point. And but thanks a lot. And for our yearbook, we needed this from you, this discussion.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And stay well. Keep up the good work.
You too.
Thank you. You too.